Well, good morning. Thank you for joining us on this beautiful, beautiful sunny morning. Um, it's been really nice weather this week. I hope you guys have been able to get out and enjoy it a little bit. Kind of cloudy in the mornings, but burns off by the afternoon. It's been beautiful. Next week coming up is Memorial Day weekend, so you'll have 3 days probably to enjoy the beautiful weather that we're getting here in San Jose. Just a couple of things. Our men's group meets here on Monday nights at 6:30 and on Zoom. If you want to be a part of that, let Pastor Carl, Pastor Carlos, or CR know, and they'll get you connected. Um, our ladies group is meeting Thursday nights at 6:30 on Zoom. Now we will not have a meeting this Thursday because Pastor Carl and I get to go to Phoenix to watch our granddaughter graduate from high school. So we're pretty excited about that. So we won't have a meeting this week, but we'll pick it up again next week. Today is our Missions Sunday. So you know the drill. You can go to thefathershouse.org, click on the giving button. You can give to Argentina or India that way. You can pay your regular tithes and offerings that way. You can mail a check to the Father's House at 133 Bernal Road, San Jose, California, 95119. Or if you live in the local area and you'd like Pastor Carl or I to come by and pick up your tithes, we'd be happy to do that. And just say hello. So that's really all I have to cover today. So short and sweet, we'll turn the time over to Pastor Carl.
Well, good morning, Father's House. Glad to be here again with you today. Like Penny said, it's a beautiful week weather-wise and a beautiful day today. And hopefully it stays this way for a while and it doesn't get overly hot. I know now we got to start looking at, man, if it starts getting overly hot, the fire dangers and stuff. But we'll just enjoy the day and what we have right now because the days have been absolutely gorgeous, haven't they? Gosh, there's not really much to talk about today other than what we've been talking about. We sure did have a great Mother's Day service last week. That was a lot of fun. I guess if you looked at the videos that we had with our live stream video on our Facebook page, then you got to see the mariachis that showed up at the end of it. There was 9 of them, and they stayed through the meal that we had as well. We just had a blast. It was a great Mother's Day, and nobody wanted to leave. Everybody that was here wanted to just stay and hang out and have street tacos and listen to the mariachis and visit. So it was a neat day we had last week. With that, then we'll kind of readjust because we talked really Mother's Day. We talked about the wedding at Cana and Mary's influence on Jesus on that first miracle recorded in the book of John. And so we're going to go back to where we were before, the week before that, and the last couple of weeks actually, and we've been talking about in the life of Jesus and Jesus being of the people and for the people. So that's kind of where we started, remember? And we started this, I think, 15 weeks ago. So we've been at it a long time, and we're not even close to being done with the life of Jesus. Of course, we're never really done with it, are we? The story of Jesus, the narratives and the things, the miracles and the things that he taught and said, they can't even be exhausted in our own minds as to what the depth of what they mean. So there's something new about them every time we look and rediscover them. With that in mind, then, we talked about last week, again, we're dealing with the Sermon on the Mount. We're just barely into it. We talked about the Beatitudes and those that live by the Beatitudes. Blessed, are the pure. Blessed are the meek, right? And the different ones about being a peacemaker and showing mercy. Those that are persecuted for the sake of righteousness, not just persecuted because they're out there doing stupid things to get them into trouble and people get mad at them. And we said that these were the people that were individuals, as persons, as individual persons. The people that live the Beatitudes are like the light of the world. They are the light of the world, as Jesus says. When we're acting like that way, that's a part of our moral character. And then the church, as it comes together with people that are made of this moral fabric of the Beatitudes, as they come together, then they become the city that's set on a hill. And so then with that, there's this proclamation that we have of the good news of Jesus Christ, the narrative story about how he came to set the captive free, proclaim and the gospel to the poor and things like that. You find in Luke chapter 4. So this week, what I want to talk about is a little bit in extending, going back into the kingdom of, or back into the Sermon on the Mount, is after the light of the world comment, that first part, he talked about that unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you cannot enter into the kingdom of heaven. And we talked a lot about that, about the difference between that which is human thinking and that which is divine thinking. And that really, when we're looking at the Sermon on the Mount, or any of Jesus' moral teachings for that matter, that when we're looking at them, there's a dimension of them that has to do more with what we talked about with the scribes and the Pharisees, where there were these exterior commands that people needed to live by. And so, we talk about one of the exterior commands that a society is governed by is just even our law, our driving laws, where it says to go 25 miles an hour, and it's there for a reason. And I know that I go over 25 often, although I shouldn't, but I do. I'm sure that most of us do. Not that I'm giving a justification, but I'm saying that the reason it's 25, it's there for a reason why it's 25. And if you're going 35 or 40, then what's going to happen is this external law is going to come and they're going to write you a ticket because you're speeding in a 25. And then there's a penalty that goes with that ticket. And so there's a part where society is driven by that kind of law, the law in a society, and it's a form of what they would call coercion. You're being coerced into ultimately by penalty to follow the laws for the common good of all the people. Well, the scribes and Pharisees, they were famous for coercing people to follow the strict law that they set out. Not the law of the things that Jesus taught, or that was taught, the Old Testament taught, but they took these things to the extreme. They became very heavy-handed in their dealing with other peoples and with the way that they worked their religion from the outside. It was all of these rules and regulations, and you can't, you can do this, no, you have to do this, and you can't do that. You've got to do, and so you know what I'm talking about. And so Jesus is saying in his teachings, he's saying, well, you scribes and Pharisees really have gotten off track as to what really it means to follow God, to be a follower of God, and to have moral character. And so he says, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, unless it becomes something in you, internal, rather than an external coercion or force put on you to obey, then your righteousness is no better than theirs. And so the idea is that in Christianity, it's the notion of not how much can I get away with and still be a Christian. It's a matter of how do I change in the inner person, in my moral fiber and character, how do I change to be more like God? And so it's not what can I get away with and still be a Christian or still go to heaven, as opposed to the idea of how can I become more like Christ? How can I become more like God wants me to be? How can I represent humanity better than what I'm doing today? So off of that, then Jesus begins this series of teachings on different aspects of the law. So we're going to talk about murder. We're going to talk about anger. We're going to talk about adultery. We're going to about in the coming weeks and divorce and some of those different things, and see why it's more important, and to understand that it's who we are inside that basically directs our exterior, our outward actions. And so that's why it's important, because whoever we are on the inside, that's what we're going to project in life. If we're an angry person, we're going to project that. If we're a bitter person, we're going to project that. And I think if we're a loving and a sensitive and a caring person, then we're going to project that in our attitudes, our words, and in our actions. And so our attitudes, our words, and our actions are always a gauge of where we are in our spiritual maturity. And that becomes important because our deeds either justify us or they condemn us. So we're going to look at a couple of those. The first one we're going to look at today, and if I don't get through them all, if I only get through part of it, that's okay. We don't have to get through everything or rush through any of this stuff. We've got plenty of time, and I'll give you enough to think about, at least for this week. So we're back again in Matthew chapter 5, and we're going to be talking here about murder. And so this is what he says in verse 21. It says, "You have heard that the ancients were told, 'You shall not commit murder,' and whoever commits murder shall be liable to the court. But I say unto you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court. And whoever says to his brother, you good for nothing, shall be guilty before the Supreme Court. And whoever says, you fool, shall be guilty enough to go into the fiery hell. Okay, there's a lot being talked about in there, right? The first one is the idea of that murder is wrong, obviously. He says, now you've heard it said that you shall not commit murder. And if you do commit murder, you're going to stand to be liable before the court to account for that. But then he goes on and says, but murder kind of is a result, well, and it can not just anger. Murder can be the result of, I guess, if jealousy is a form of anger, but there can be an anger, and that anger will cause you to do something against someone else. Like we see the first murder in the Old Testament, the Genesis account, Cain and Abel. But the idea is that whenever we harbor anger, what happens is that as we allow it to fester and grow, and we keep that anger towards somebody, what happens is it affects all of our life, the way we perceive that person, and the way that we treat that person. Again, remember we're talking about, so murder is this external law, thou shalt not murder, but Jesus is saying, but if you think about it inside, to remain angry with somebody is not a good thing because it's going to make your actions, it's going to make your actions and your attitude towards them are going to change. And the idea here is I don't think it's wrong to be angry at injustice or angry when somebody has wronged you in any way. I don't really think that's what Jesus is saying, because God gave us the emotion of anger. And anger can have a good to it and it can have a bad to it, can't it? I mean, let's say you see somebody that is being oppressed, and I think that a good one for that to look at would be, I think with the needless dying of George Floyd, and when our nation and the world watched what happened to him with the police officer on his neck until he died, there's a part in us, I would hope and think, that anger should rise in us for the injustice that was done to him. And that anger would be a right anger, because that anger would be almost a righteous indignation that one human could treat another in such a poor manner and has needlessly caused the end of his life. And so in that case, the anger would be justified. But the idea is if you carry that anger on and that hate on, then your actions will begin to reflect that, right? And so let's say that somebody wants to carry that on, the anger about George Floyd, and they get angry at society. And as they get angry at society, maybe they start to do things that they wouldn't normally do, like be mad at the police and, whatever the case might be, because there was something in them that caused their actions to change. And what Jesus is saying, I think, is those kind of anger, when you get angry, is okay. That's just a part of our emotion. But how do you process that anger? And so then he goes on talking about in the next section, he says, and any one of you that's angry at your brother in that way, and basically, and when you call him worthless, good for nothing, a fool or a full-headed person, and you're speaking that with malice towards them, or in other words, devaluing who they are, then it's very interesting what Jesus says, because Jesus says, in that case, that you'll be guilty of hellfire, or Gehenna, is what he's saying. What is Jesus saying there, and what isn't he saying? He's not talking about the place that we would call Christian belief in hell or eternal hell. He's talking about the fact, when he's talking in the New Testament about this idea of hell that we find there, he's talking about the dump or the area where garbage was being burned, or the fires of Gehenna. And it was where the rubbish from the city was outside the city, and they would burn that. Well, people would be banished to those areas in some cases if they had done wrong things. And so it's almost like this idea of time out. So Jesus would say, when you get like that, you're going to be isolated from the rest of the public, because you're not going to be good for the common good of the public. And so there's this isolation that happens. So I think that in that you can kind of see that what Jesus is saying, that when it comes to anger, is to be angry is one thing, and the Apostle Paul says, be angry and yet do not sin. But when you let anger become a place, in that anger to where you start to reflect negative emotions towards other people that are made in the dignity and likeness of God, you're now walking on a slippery slope, and that would be sin. Because the way that we treat people is very important to God. And, again, James talks about that. It says, how can you say that you love God whom you haven't seen when you don't even love your brother or sister who you have seen? And so with anger and with all of this, you can see where if we let things fester in us, then we're going to have problems. And Jesus is saying, the internal law says you need to let that anger go. Deal with it a different way. If you're angry at somebody and you can't get over it, go see a counselor. Go see a psychologist. Work that stuff through, because to have that kind of anger for that long is unbecoming of a Christian. Okay? So let's go to the next one, and then we'll end here. It says, therefore, after he talks about angry, right? And he says, therefore, if you are presenting your offering at the altar, now this would be entering a worship, or like a worship service, right? Or an offering before God. Therefore, if you are presenting your offering at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your offering there before the altar and go first and be reconciled to your brother, and then come and present your offering. And then he says, secondly, make friends quickly with your opponents at law while you are with them on the way, so that your opponent may not hand you over to the judge and the judge to the officers, and you be thrown into prison. Truly I say to you, you will not come out of there until you have paid every last cent. Two things happening here. The first one has to do with worship and reconciliation. The second one, and in some cases, and the second one, when it talks about your opponent going with you into a court of law, it has to do ultimately with justice. So in the first account, he's saying, and it's very important to realize what's being said here. It's not saying that you need to leave your offering at the altar if your brother or sister has something against you. That's their responsibility. But what he is saying, if you've angered somebody, and if you've hurt somebody, and if you bring your offering and you think it's okay, like up above, to call somebody a worthless fool, to treat them less than how God would want you to treat them, and if you think it's okay for you to bring your offering before God and to present it before Him in an act of worship, God says, you're not ready to give your offering yet. You're not ready to give your offering yet because you're not right with your brother or your sister. Let's go back to Cain and Abel, the first murder. When Abel and Cain presented an offer before God, Abel's was accepted for one reason and Cain's was rejected for another reason. Well, Cain at that time got very jealous of his brother. He got angry at his brother. He got angry that he had failed, and I think there was some remorse there, because he realized that he'd failed God to some level because of the offering. The offering wasn't brought right. So then he plotted to kill his brother, Cain did, and God comes to him and says, why is it that you're downcast, and why is it that you're so angry at your brother? And he says, the offering didn't go well, but you'll have another chance to make the right offering if you will. He says, but I'm going to warn you, Cain, about your anger towards your brother, because sin is crouching at the door, and its desire is for you, but you must master it. Cain, rather than mastering that anger and that sin that was crouching at the door, that falling short that was crouching at the door, rose up and killed his brother Abel and became the first murderer that we find in all of humanity. Now, that's to say, again, that you can see there that the offering wasn't accepted earlier, maybe for another reason. What God's saying is that when we have things against our brother, it's up to us to deal with our heart and to go and restore that relationship with our brother, or restore that relation with our sister, our wife, our mother, our father, our siblings, and what have you, other family members. So, or members, anybody in society that we may be harboring those things against. So you can kind of see the trend there that Jesus is talking about what's inside of us. The next one I talked about, and I'm going to close it out here, is where it says, and when you're going to a court of law with somebody or your opponent, because you've got differences, you better settle the account before you get before the judge than when you get there. Because if you have offended that person, if you have done something wrong, I'm going to tell you you're going to pay for it. So what he's saying there is, whenever you go to before a court of law, if you think about it, let's think about somebody that goes to a court of law because they've been wronged in one way or another. Let's say somebody, well, I guess you could say that somebody stole something from you. They broke into your house and they stole, let's say, a diamond ring or something. And you ultimately knew who it was. And after them paying their penalties or whatever, you were going to file a civil suit against them because you didn't feel like justice had been served by the law. Maybe stealing diamond wouldn't be a good one, but the idea is that justice wasn't served. So in this case, what Jesus is talking about, he says, when you're going to a court of law, what you're basically doing is you're looking for justice. That's why the court is there, so that they can hear the case of both sides and figure out what is just to do between the two representing parties. And so what he's saying here is he's saying, it's probably better to not wait until it goes before a court of law. Because I'm going to tell you something. If you've treated somebody unjustly, you probably need to write that before you get there. And you should probably have righted it already before you got there. And so what he's saying is, in this case, is that the kingdom of God and within us is that God desires for us, well, let's go back first, the idea of murder, the idea of not having or treating people with dignity, being angry with them, without cause, and then letting that anger fester, and then the idea that we're not being reconciled to our brother, or sister, and we're still talking about reconciliation here. But he's talking about here that your job as a Christian from the inside and the way that you project yourself towards other people should always be with justice in their mind, with the best intention for them, of giving them their equal due in matters when you know it should be done. So he's saying, don't go into a court of law when you know that you've been inequitable in your justice towards somebody, because you're going to pay. So anyway, you can see what I'm talking about here when we're talking about Sermon on the Mount, and how there are these internal attitudes that we have, or the beatitudes that we talked about earlier, and this moral character we have by which we govern our lives. What you can notice about this is these are not laws. These are character traits that we have. It's not so much of what can I do and still remain a Christian. It's how can I become like this. In everything we've talked about today, you're not going to be perfect, and neither am I. I'm never going to go over 25 miles an hour again. I'm going to do that. I'm going to sometimes be angry without cause at my brother or my sister. I'm just going to do that. We're all going to do that. But the idea is, how do we change to become more like what Jesus wants us to be? Maybe the best way to say it. How do we change to where we become more human, or what the human nature ought to be at its highest ideal? And so I hope that today, as we talk about this, go through this, that you maybe reflect on that. You reflect maybe in the verses we've read, maybe different situations, maybe a relationship struggle you have with somebody, or somebody has with you, and you ask God to give you revelation on how you can be more like God. I think every one of us wants to be more like Jesus and less like ourselves. And the only way that happens, if we take these things seriously, and we begin to self-reflect on who we are, our attitudes, our actions, and our words, and say, God, this needs to be changed. Will you help me? I think when you do that, you'll find that God will always be there and say, absolutely. If you want to change for the good, I'm always in that. I think you'll find God's presence. So I hope today you'll say yes to looking and self-reflecting on areas that you can change. I'm going to do the same thing this week. I think I've talked enough today. I hope that you have a great day, and I'll get back to you next week as we talk a little bit more through the life of Jesus.